So I like sewing this bag. It turns out so beautiful, and it just makes me happy looking at these scraps that I've used in different projects. So it has like a nostalgic feel for me as well. So I'm really excited to just kind of jump into this and start planning out. This is almost like a fabric collage, but again, I'm using some fabric scraps that I've had from other projects. And I just pulled out some pinks and I guess some peaches and a little bit of red that has pink florals in it. So just kind of mixing all different things together, but I am pulling fabrics that I think go together. And of course, here's my florals. I always have to have a lot of florals in here as well. So I'm kind of starting with the floral in the center here. And then I'm just pulling fabrics from this pile that I've kind of pressed and just trying to see what goes well together. And for me, that really means not so much that it doesn't clash, even though that's a thing, but I just want to make sure that it kind of pulls out the pretty parts in it. So in the center, I have this floral that has some like reddish orange, and then I have a fabric on the side that kind of brings that out. So I'm really just trying to accent these fabrics so that it makes each one look really good. So that's kind of the way I do these collages, just to kind of bring out the best in all these different fabrics. And I do have some white backgrounds with some natural background, and as long as they look good together, I just go for it. So if it looks too clashy or too different so that it's distracting, like in this case, like this black, then I will just pull that out and use something else, because I like doing things like that, but it has to be balanced. So if I used black in one area, I would want to use it again in a different area and just kind of balance it out a little bit. So for this bag, I pulled out a pile of scraps, but it doesn't really take that many. So what I'm doing here is I just took a letter size piece of paper, and I'm just making it this, when I sew this all together, I want it to be a little bit bigger than that letter size piece of paper. So if you have A4 paper, that will work as well, but you just want it to be, you know, an ½ inch to an inch or so bigger, or, you know, 2 or 3 centimeters bigger all the way around what you're doing. And that way, when we trim it down, then the bag will be the perfect size. So that's why in this case we're doing a little bit larger, because when we're sewing it, it's going to shrink down a little bit, and we just want to make sure that our finished size is letter size, or if you're using A4 paper, you want to trim it 22 centimeters by 28 centimeters when you're done. So like I said, we just want to sew it a little bit bigger all the way around than a regular letter size or A4 piece of paper. So what I'm going to do is just sew these different scraps together, and I'm just going to keep doing it until, for me, it's kind of hanging past this letter size piece of paper. So I'm pulling a couple pieces out here, and I just want to make sure that the second piece that I'm adding is longer than the first, and then I can trim it down so that they're nice and square. And some of these fabrics are the same on both sides, but when you're doing this, you want to put right sides together. So like this, kind of like a bright pink fabric, both sides are the right side. I think it's a batik, so it looks good on both sides. So once you get started with this, it really does go pretty quickly. So I'm going to do like long lines of fabric, and then I'll add like sections to it that are at least as long or longer. But then I can also add like long strips, and then that way I won't have like pieces missing, if that makes any sense. So you just want to make sure that whatever you're sewing on is going to be long enough so that it covers the whole next strip. So here I'm doing like smaller pieces, but then I'll add those together until they're long enough to add to the main piece here. Another way you could do it is, like, let's say you wanted to just put fabrics together, and then they were all like, let's say 4-inch squares or something, and then you can just add those together. So there's a few different ways of doing this. So as I'm sewing here, I'm probably making some changes to the fabric. I just want to make sure that everything looks right and it looks balanced. So some people say they just pull it out of a bag and they just sew whatever they pulled out of the bag. And that's definitely a different way of doing it as well. You could just kind of get whatever you get. That would be kind of a cool thing to do. So my scraps, I have them organized where I have like a bag of pink, I have a bag of floral, I have a bag of reds, and then I think I might have pulled out some tans here too, which I don't think I'll end up using, but like my pinks are also like peaches, and my floral bag is just all different colors. If it, you know, like this has a natural background with all different colors of flowers, then I'll just put that in my floral bag. But that way I have, you know, like the 2-gallon baggies, and that's about as many scraps as I have in each color. And then that way when I'm doing a project, I can just pull certain bags out and use those. And it just helps me to organize my scraps. And then also if you put them in like a Ziploc bag, you can really kind of crunch them down so it conserves a lot of space. But I find that I pull my scraps by color, so that really works for me. So here I'm just adding some longer strips, and I'm trying to add these bigger strips towards the sides, and that way when I sew the bag together I don't have a whole bunch of seams coming together on those sides. So if you do have larger pieces of fabric, that might be a good place to put them. So here's our finished top, and again I'm showing you the letter size piece of paper, and I've done it quite a bit bigger, which I didn't mean to, but that's just the way it turned out. So then I cut a piece of quilt batting the same size, and then a piece of fabric for the inside of the bag, and that's that pink fabric. So I have the right sides of the pink fabric showing and the right sides of my scrap fabric showing, and then of course the quilt batting doesn't matter. So I have those all sandwiched together, and then now we're going to put a piece of washi tape so we can get a good quilting line here, a nice straight line, and then we're going to take that to the sewing machine. So these are the other pieces that you'll need. You'll need 2 5-inch squares, and I've done them from the same fabric, but you could use different fabrics if you want. And then 2 strips that are 1 3/4 by 12.5, and 1 strip that is 2 by 8.5, and that will be in the description as well. So you can see I kind of pulled some fabric that had a lot of purple in it, and the reason I did that is because I know that not too much of this fabric is going to be showing. So I think that it will really look nice. If the pieces were this big, I might not have picked it, but since I know I'll be sewing it down, then and less will be showing, then I kind of figured out that it would look pretty good. So I went ahead with that. So the 5-inch squares, they're going to show mostly on the inside of the bag. You'll see a little bit on the outside of the bag, but mostly it'll be on the inside of the bag. So I don't know if that will help you choose which fabrics to use there. But anyhow, these fabrics I feel like all coordinate really well together, and they kind of bring, you know, each one brings out the other fabric well. So that's kind of what I was looking for here. Okay, so now we're putting this piece of washi tape in, and I'm just using one of the seams to kind of line this up to be a straight line. And then we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to go ahead and sew this. So I don't have anything special going on in my sewing machine here, or just the regular foot, and I'm just sewing it. But what I'm doing is sewing a line, and then I'm repositioning that washi tape to line it up with the line that I just sewed. And then I'm just going to keep doing that. So I started in the center, and I'm going to keep doing that towards one side, and then I'm going to turn around and do it towards the other side. So the reason why we do that, instead of just sewing on one side and going all the way down, is when you sew in the middle, if there's any kind of, you know, it's not straight or flat or something, it pushes it to one side. Otherwise, if you start on one side, by the time you get to the other side, you may have things bubbling. So typically when you're quilting something, you start around the center, and then you just can go to one side, and then you turn around and do to the other side. So these quilting lines are probably about 3/4 of an inch apart, and you can go larger than that. You definitely could go smaller too, but you can definitely go larger than that. It only needs a few lines of quilting to kind of hang it together. So now I'm just starting from the middle and I'm doing towards the other side now. And just using washi tape just gives you nice, like equal sections of quilting. But they don't have to be equal. You can do whatever you want here. And I'm using a light pink thread. I started out using like a peach color thread, but that thread was not running through my machine really well, so I ended up just doing like a line of that. And then now I'm using this light pink thread, and they look so similar you don't even notice that it's different thread. But I was thinking, it made me think that you could use different colors of thread in quilting something like this if you wanted to take the time to change your thread. I think that would look pretty nice. So here I'm just doing the one last quilting line. And then I'm going to trim this down to the right size. So for me it's 8.5 by 11 because I'm using letter size paper. And if you're using A4, you want to trim it to 22 centimeters by 28 centimeters. So we have quilted along the long side. So for me, the 11-inch side. And now I'm going to add those 12.5-inch long strips that are 1 3/4 inches wide. And I'm going to put it on the inside fabric of our zipper pouch. And I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam here, and I would call it a scant 1/4 inch seam because we just don't want it any larger than a 1/4 inch. And I'm just going to sew that seam down this edge so the strip is matching the side of this zipper pouch. Like it's like the body of our zipper pouch. But then I have a little bit hanging over top and bottom, and I do right sides together. So right now we're seeing kind of the yucky side of that strip. We're seeing the nice side of the inside of the bag and the yucky side of the 12.5-inch long strip. So now I'm just doing my scant 1/4 inch seam. And when we're done sewing this, we're just going to wrap it around to the front, and then we're going to fold over a 1/4 inch and then kind of fold it again, and I'll show you that. And then we're going to sew it again from the front, which for us is the outside of the bag. So now I'm just folding in about a 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm folding it over again. And what we're trying to do here is cover that seam that we just sewed. So we're covering it not too much, like only a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch. But just enough to cover that. So this is called a binding strip. And then I'm just going to sew about a 1/16 of an inch in from the edge of this strip here. But that gives us a really nice finished edge. And what we're doing is we're doing this on the long edge on this side, and then we're going to do it on the other long edge. And then the two short sides just stay raw. So I'm just sewing a bit, then I'm repositioning it just so it is nice and straight. And I didn't pull it tight at all. I actually just kind of folded it around very easy, because if you pull it at all, it's not going to lay flat. The more easy you are with it, the flatter it will lay. Okay, so now we have this one strip, and I'm just going to trim these sides. So we did it so that it was hanging over both sides, and that way when we're done sewing here, we can just trim it perfectly straight. So now I've done both sides, and again, the short sides, we're just going to leave them alone. They just stay raw. So now we are going to work on some pieces that we're going to add to the zipper. So the first thing that we're going to do here is work on a piece for our pull tabs. And what you do is you take that 2 by 8.5 inch strip, and I just basically fold it in on one side like a 1/4 inch, and on the other side about 1/2 inch. And that gives us about a 5/8 inch wide piece. And then I'm sewing down the right side, the left side, and then the center. And then now I'm folding it in half. I trim both edges, get those things off, and then I cut it in half. So that's our 2 tab pulls. And now you take the 2 5-inch squares, and we're going to sew nice seams on 2 of the sides for each square. So just pick a side, and then I'm folding in a 1/4 inch, folding it over another 1/4 inch, and then I'm just going to sew that. And then we're going to do that again on the opposite side of this square. And then we're going to do the same thing to the other square. And again, those 2 sides that we're not sewing, they just stay perfectly raw. So you don't have to do anything to those. So I'm going to sew these seams, and then I'm going to take them to my iron, and just, my iron's like a nice hot iron, and I can just then quickly press it nice and flat. So this process doesn't take long at all. It only takes a minute to do this. So in a minute we'll be adding these to our zipper, the zipper ends. So we're going to do a couple things to the zipper, and you do need a 9-inch closed bottom zipper or a 23 centimeter, which is I think the same size. So these are our 2 finished 5-inch squares. So here is our, like the main body of our zipper pouch that we've already done. And in a minute we'll be adding it to our zipper, but first we need to put those pieces, extra pieces on our zipper. Okay, so this is the zipper that I'm going to use, and now we'll be working on that zipper. So we're just going to sew the ends of the zipper together on both sides. This kind of depends on what your zipper is like. But it is easier to sew, like I'm sewing pretty close to the end here, maybe a 1/4 inch from the end. And all I'm going to do is sew so that those 2 zipper ends are together. And when we're doing other steps, this just helps them to not kind of fly around, because they do like to do that. So I do this kind of slow just to make sure that it doesn't get messed up. And you know, of course, if it doesn't work out, you can always seam rip it and do it over again. But this just does really help to stabilize this for the other steps that we're doing, because you just don't want something flopping around and you didn't know that was happening, and then you have to like take everything out. So it's just a good kind of pre-sewing step to do here. And then we're going to do it for the other end where the zipper is. And here you just want to look where those 2 ends go together, and just make sure they're in the right spot when you're sewing this together, just so that we don't sew it together and then have it be harder to close. But this little step I think is worth it, because it just makes these next steps quicker and easier and less prone to having any trouble. So I sew the first half, and then I kind of stop, and then I just make sure that that second half of the zipper is close to the first half, and then I start sewing again. And that's usually enough to just get these 2 together. And that way when we pull this zipper pull back, the end of the zipper is not flying all over the place. It's still nice and together, so that does help. And then I'm just opening and shutting it, make sure I didn't do anything to misalign it. So now we're going to work on those little tabs. And what we're going to do, we're just going to make sure that the not so nice side is in, and then we're going to go ahead and sew those. And again, right to the end of the tab, because this is, again, we're doing like a pre-sewing step here, just to make sure that these are sewed together so they stay lined up. Because I have had it where like I'm sewing multiple pieces at once, and then these little tabs want to separate, the ends want to separate, and then they're not totally lined up, and then you have to take the whole thing apart just to get that realigned. So it's easier just to realign it in this little step here. So I'm going to sew both of the tabs like that, just kind of sew them right on the end. And again, you just want to make sure the nice side is out, and the sides that we folded in, that those are on the inside. But just adjust that, first of all, that both of them are the same, and then second of all, just the way that you prefer it. And then we're going to center that on the zipper. And again, this step, I'm sewing this close to the end of the zipper, because this is not our final step. So I'm just trying to get these in place. And then when we add our 5-inch square, that's when we'll sew the seam in the correct place. So right to the end there. And again, just centering it on the zipper. Because if this pull is to one side, it's going to look a little odd. So you just want to make sure it's centered. And then we do the same for the other side. Okay, so now we've sewn these tabs on both sides, and now we're going to add this 5-inch square. So of course now it's not exactly 5-inch, but so what I'm doing is I'm just putting the right side up of the 5-inch square, and then I'm putting the right side of the zipper down. And then I'm just going to sew a 1/4-inch seam here. And I'm going to sew, I have my zipper foot on now, and I'm going to sew right up to that metal place on the zipper. So it's like snugged right against the bottom of that zipper, like where it will open. And that way there's no gaps there. And I have it centered on that 5-inch square. So once you open that, you can kind of see the zippers in the right place, the tabs in the right place, and your squares in the right place. And then we do that on both ends. And then now we're going to add the body of this zipper pouch to the actual zipper. So what we're going to do here is we're going to center it on the zipper. So by that, what I mean is you can see just each end here is hanging about 1 inch over, like where that tab area is. Yours may be a little bit different dimensions depending on your zipper. And then I'm just going to put a pin in here. So I'm leaving about 1/8 of an inch between the zipper teeth and where I'm going to sew. And all I'm doing here is I'm top stitching that binding strip that we added, and I'm just top stitching that down to the zipper. So I'm laying that binding strip on top of my tab. It's on top of the 5-inch square. You just kind of leave those 5-inch squares hanging out the side. And then you put it on top of your tab. But then we start sewing a stitch length in front of the tab. So we're not sewing on the tab at all, but the binding strip is laying on top of the tab. So this just helps to align everything. And then when you're done sewing, it just lays really nice. So now I'm just going to take about 1/16 of an inch seam here and just top stitch the zipper all the way down. And we're going to sew this a few stitches. You know, we're right in front of that tab. We're going to sew 2 or 3 stitches, and then we're going to back tack 2 or 3 stitches. And then I'm just going to sew this all the way down, but I'm just going slowly because I just want to make sure that it's nice and straight. And if you need to pull that zipper out of the way, you know, the zipper pull, go ahead and do that. And I'm just going to sew this slowly all the way to the end. So I'm doing a few stitches, and then I'm just making sure everything's lined up still. Maybe you need to pull out a pin or whatever. And then now as you get towards this tab that we added to the zipper, you just want to lay that binding strip on top of the tab so it's nice and lined up. And then you just want to sew, you want to stitch the stitch length before the tab, and then we'll also back tack. So I just kind of showed you where to stop stitching there. So sew right up to it, and then back tack a few stitches here, and then give it a nice like extra strength. And then we've added it to the first side of the zipper. And then I just check the zipper again usually and just make sure that everything is working and that I didn't stitch anything shut. And then these 5-inch squares are just kind of hanging out to the side. And they're underneath, you know, these other pieces. So now what we're going to do, we're pulling this part of the bag around. And you want to just make sure that the tops are lined up here. And that 5-inch square again is just under everything. You want to make sure that this part is lined up, and then we're just going to put a pin in there. Just make sure that it doesn't get off kilter at all. You just want to make sure you're going through just the top layer and not the bottom layer of this bag. So when we're adding this second side onto our zipper, we're going to again top stitch this. We're going to be dealing with the bottom of the bag that has to stay out of the way because we can't sew through that. So that's going to be the challenge here on the second side of putting this zipper on. So what you're going to do is you're going to open the zipper, and then we're going to go as far to one side as you can. It will be about 1 inch or 2 away from the first tab there. And we'll go back and sew that in a minute. So we're going to start here, and you just want to make sure that you're only sewing through the zipper part and the binding strip, that the rest of the bag is to the side and it's out of the way. So I'm going to hand crank to start this just so I can get that needle right where I want it, and then we'll go a few stitches and back tack just so that's nice and strong. And then we'll just sew to the end of the bag again. To the I shouldn't say to the end of the bag, but to the tab here. So we're just top stitching all the way down. And since we're trying to keep that bag to one side, you just want to take several stitches, and then if you need to kind of reposition the zipper and making sure that bag is out of the way. It's a short, you know, this is a 9-inch zipper, so it's not much to sew, but we do want to make sure that we're taking a few stitches and then making sure it's straight. And we do need to reposition the zipper a little bit. So now we're going to sew right again up to the tab and then back tack. And then we're going to go back and do the other side. So if for some reason with your zipper, if you can't get all the way to the tab, this is what we're going to do, and I'll show you how to get back to that. So now I'm just taking that 5-inch square and just making sure that that's underneath everything and it's off to the side. And now I'm just going to roll back the back of this bag, and I'm pinning it, but it might be better to safety pin it. And then we're just going to start sewing again from where we left off, and I'm just going to hand crank that down and put it right where we stopped sewing before, and then we're going to back tack again. And you just want to make sure that that underneath that we rolled back, that the back of the bag, that you're not sewing through that it's behind your sewing machine needle. And we're going to lay that binding strip on top of the tab again, and we're just going to sew up to the tab and then back tack. And if you need to repeat that on the other side, then you can easily do that. Just make sure that you roll the back of the bag back and then pin it so that we're not sewing through the back of the bag. Okay, so now I'm just going to take this pin out. So now we're turning the bag inside out, and we're going to take a 1/4 inch seam here. So I'm just kind of pushing these sides out and make sure it's all there. And the other thing you want to do is make sure that that pull tab that we sewed in is facing towards the middle of the bag. We do not want to catch that in this seam. So it needs to be pointing inward at this point. And if you can catch the top of this like 5-inch square seam that you did before, and we can sew that in, it just depends on your zipper, then you could sew that down here. And here I'm doing like a generous 1/4 inch, even up to a 1/2 inch is okay. But you just want to sew this seam. And remember, our tab pull is like where the zipper is, so you could sew up to that and then just make sure that it's inside the bag. We don't want to be catching that in this seam. And then we just sew the seam all the way down, and then we do the same thing for the other side. So before you sew this seam, you do want to make sure that the zipper is centered and that the bag is centered. Sometimes it can kind of warp to one side. You just want to make sure that it's nice and centered. And now we turned our bag right side out here, and I'm just making sure those 5-inch squares aren't like bunched up in the corner. And I'm making sure my zipper works here. And now we're going to box those corners. So I'm just popping this up on the seam that we just sewed. And I'm taking my ruler and I'm measuring 3/4 inch over from where that point should be. So if you didn't get the point all the way out, you just want to make sure that that 3/4 inch is where the point should be. So just showing here how to pop this up, because sometimes it can be confusing. So the seam that we're going to center this on is the one that we just sewed. So you want to go 3/4 inch in from where the point is supposed to be, and then 3/4 inch up and 3/4 inch down. And if that is not what's showing, like let's say you have a much larger on one side than the other, just refold it so that you're drawing a 3/4 inch line upward from the seam and a 3/4 inch line downward from the seam, and then it's over 3/4 inch from where that point should be. And that seam should be parallel to here our binding strip, and that way we know our box seams are going to be nice and straight. And if we sew each of the 4 the same size, then we know that they're going to be the bag will sit evenly as well. So we're just going to sew this seam, and then we're going to trim it. And we are sewing this on the right side of the bag. It doesn't seem like the right thing to be doing, but that is the way that we do it. So we're sewing the seam, and then I'm going to trim that down to about 1/8 inch. And you don't want to have it more than that really, and you don't want to really have it less, because if there's not enough material here, then you might accidentally go through the seam we just sewed. So we do that to all 4 corners, and then we turn our bag inside out. And now we take that 5-inch square, and again, when we're sewing our box corners, you just want to make sure that 5-inch square is kind of pulled out of the corner. Otherwise, you might accidentally catch this in that seam. So now we just fold this up, and we pin it across the top, even though we're not going to sew it there, but at least it puts it in place. And I'm just taking note of where I just sewed that box corner on the outside, because where we started and stopped, that's the same place we want to start and stop on this seam as well. And so I'm just kind of taking note of that, and I'm popping it out, but I'm being gentle, because if I push it too hard, that seam might just pop right through, and don't want that to happen. So now we're going to sew this seam, and this is going to be a 1/4 inch seam. So it kind of feels weird going over a 1/4 inch and sewing, but you really do have to sew that whole 1/4 inch, because otherwise the seam that we just sewed, we're going to see it on the outside of the bag. So if that does happen, you just want to go back to this seam that we're sewing right now, and you just want to sew it wider, because this is a French seam, so that first seam is getting encapsulated in this seam. And so if that doesn't work out for some reason, you just want to sew this one wider. But that's why we trim it to like 1/8 of an inch, so that it doesn't stick out when we're done here. And this area of the bag where this 5-inch square is, when you're done with the bag, you can actually sew the top of this shut if you want to from the outside of the bag, or from the inside if you want to hand do it. But for me, it sits fine not even sewing it, so I just leave it the way it is. So I'm taking these pins back out, and now here I'm just sewing that other 1/4 inch seam. And again, I'm just taking note. You could sew it from the other side if you want. That's totally fine, because I'm just trying to know like where the seam starts and where it stops, and I'm just trying to echo that on this side. And that just makes our box corners even and straight. And here I am going slowly because this is a lot of layers, so I'm just taking it nice and slow and back tacking. And then we do this on both sides, and we turn our bag out, and then our bag is done. So this zipper pouch fits a lot of pens. It's a nice big bag. It doesn't look as big as it really is, so it's a really nice size to sew and a lot of fun. And I just feel like this turned out so pretty. I really like it a lot. So I hope that you enjoyed this and that you sew this as well. So thank you.